Countries fight, sometimes over things as silly as an argument over a pig, sometimes for very serious reasons, like in World War II. Many of these wars and disputes lead to countries collapsing and other countries being born. Sometimes the people in or outside these new countries do not like where the borders were drawn, which leads to more conflict, which leads to more countries falling and others being born, and the cycle continues. There will never be a time when everyone, everywhere, is happy about what countries are where or where the borders lie. Geopolitical hotspots change, and some places that were previously unstable and fragile are now stable, and vice versa. Some territorial or geopolitical disputes or tensions are between independent sovereign states, and others are unrecognized states attempting to gain independence from independent states. Undoubtedly, there is overlap between these two scenarios. For example, if two countries were geopolitically opposed to each other, and there was an independence movement in a part of one of the countries, it would be in the interests of the other country to support said independence movement in order to geopolitically weaken their opposition. In this series of videos, I will go through and explain the cases of the unrecognized states of the world. And by unrecognized, I mean de facto states that are not members or observer states of the UN. So sorry to leave you out, Palestine, but you deserve a whole series of videos by yourself. The first country is the Republic of China. In 1912, the Xinhai Revolution concluded with a Republican victory, which put an end to the Qing dynasty and 2 millennia of monarchical rule. The Republican leader Sun Yat-sen became president, but ceded it to Yuan Shikai. The death of the President Yuan in 1916 led to a power vacuum that led to a power struggle in the country. This led to what is known as the warlord era between 1916 and 1928. By the late 1920s, most of the warlords had been defeated, and a civil war between the two main factions remaining, the nationalist Kuomintang and the communist Chinese Communist Party, ensued. The war started in 1927, with the Communist Party launching an uprising in Nanchang and creating the Red Army. The Red Army had early successes, with, in 1931, them defeating the nationalist forces 3 times in large-scale attacks, causing the nationalist forces to lose nearly 100,000 soldiers, and in the spring of 1933, them defeating the nationalist forces' 4th large-scale attack and eliminating 2.5 of its elite divisions. By 1934, however, the nationalists purchased new German weapons and launched a 5th large-scale attack on the Red Army's base in Jiangxi province. The Red Army lost more than 50,000 soldiers in this battle and had to leave Jiangxi province to establish a new base. This was the beginning of what is known as the Long March, in which most of the Red Army died in an attempt to evade the Kuomintang. What was left was a considerably smaller but very dedicated and cohesive group. During and after the time of the Long March, a guy called Mao Zedong rose up as leader. You might have heard of him. On the 12th of December 1936, several nationalist generals, headed by Yang Qiucheng of Shaanxi, kidnapped Chiang Kai-shek, the then leader of the Kuomintang, for 2 weeks in what is known as the Qinyuan incident. They forced him into making a second united front with the communists against Japan. Not long after this, the Second Sino-Japanese War started, with Japan full-scale invading China in 1937. The nationalists and communists both focused on fighting Japan. although the nationalists definitely got the brunt of it. And despite horrible atrocities against their people, like the Nanjing massacre, the Second United Front managed to beat the Japanese, and the civil war between the communists and nationalists resumed. The war with Japan came at the perfect time for the communists, as they were in a very weak position coming out of the Long March with a much smaller force. By the end of the war with Japan, the power of the Communist Party grew considerably. At the same time, as I just said, as the nationalists taking the brunt of the fighting against the Japanese. The communists' main force grew to 1.2 million troops, backed with an additional militia of 2 million, totaling 3.2 million troops. Their liberated zone in 1945 contained 19 base areas, including 1/4 of the country's territory and 1/3 of its population. This included many important towns and cities. From this time on, the communists were well on top, and by 1949 they had control of all of China and established the People's Republic of China, which I will call the PRC for the rest of this video. The nationalists retreated to Taiwan and made Taipei the capital of the Republic of China, which I will call the ROC for the rest of this video. This is the case to this day. Until 1971, the United Nations recognized the ROC as the sole representative of China. It was at that point that the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 2758, which recognized the PRC as the only legitimate representative of China to the United Nations, and removed the representative of Chiang Kai-shek, or the ROC, from the United Nations. The ROC and PRC do not recognize each other's statehood, and each enforces its own version of the One China policy, meaning that no state can recognize both of them at the same time. The ROC is currently recognized by 14 UN member states and the Holy See. Almost all the remaining UN member states recognize the PRC instead of the ROC, and either accept the PRC's territorial claim over Taiwan, take a non-committal position on Taiwan's status, or sidestep the Taiwan issue entirely. A significant number of PRC recognizing UN member states nonetheless conduct officially non-diplomatic relations with the ROC, designating it as either Taipei or Taiwan. Another example is the ROC competing as Chinese Taipei in the Olympics. In 1971, the support of African nations was crucial in the PRC joining the UN, taking over the seat of the ROC. Prior to this, China became lobbying Africa extensively, getting the PRC recognized one country at a time. Before long, these political commitments were being repaid in concrete and steel, as China started building railroads, hospitals, universities, and stadiums throughout the continent. This soft power continues today, with most of Africa under the geopolitical control of China, and therefore agrees with the PRC's One China policy. While Taiwanese investments in Africa are about $500 million a year, Chinese Exim Bank alone invested $20 billion over 3 years. While most of Africa is strongly on the side of the PRC, accepting their version of the One China policy and having no relations with Taiwan whatsoever, many countries in the world take a more moderate position on the Taiwanese question. These countries have formal relations with the PRC only, but have informal relations or mutual de facto embassies with Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is the position of the US. With the Taiwan Relations Act, the US cut formal diplomatic relations with the ROC on Taiwan in 1979 in order to recognize the PRC in Beijing. This act started what is referred to as US strategic ambiguity. This deliberately ambiguous position is whether and how it would defend the ROC on Taiwan in the event of an attack by the PRC. The US does not openly contest China's claim to Taiwan, but is committed by law to ensure the island can defend itself and to treat all threats toward it as matters of grave concern. An example of this is the US arms sales to Taiwan. The most recent was the sale of 40 M109 howitzers to the tune of $750 million. The policy is intended to discourage both the unilateral declaration of independence by ROC leaders and an invasion of Taiwan by the PRC. In 1982, the 6 assurances, which are 6 key foreign policy principles of the US in relation to Taiwan, were first proposed by the Kuomintang of the ROC on Taiwan and then agreed to by the Reagan administration. They are as follows. 1. The United States has not agreed to set a date for ending arms sales to Taiwan. 2. The United States has not agreed to consult with the PRC on arms sales to Taiwan. 3. The United States will not play a mediation role between Taipei and Beijing, or the ROC and PRC. 4. The United States has not agreed to revise the Taiwan Relations Act. 5. The US has not altered its position regarding sovereignty over Taiwan. And 6. The United States will not exert pressure on Taiwan to enter into negotiations with the PRC. While these assurances truly established strategic ambiguity on the American side, notice all of the assurances start with saying what the US will not do. They brought stability for the Kuomintang in Taiwan, as it was a commitment to keep the status quo. This status quo was important for Taiwan, because although with the Taiwan Relations Act, the US did say it would ensure the island could defend itself, it did explicitly cut formal relations with Taiwan, and this is a geopolitically unstable move. Since 2019, China has begun flying planes into Taiwan's ADIZ, or Air Defense Identification Zone, without asking Taiwan's permission. These incursions have ratcheted up recently, with last month setting a record of 56 planes going into the ADIZ in one day. This increase in incursions has made Taiwan understandably anxious. Guoxiang, Taiwan's defense minister, has said that Taiwan-China relations are at a 40-year low. He has also said that China would be ready for a full-scale invasion of Taiwan by 2025. This would more than likely not just stay between Taiwan and China either. Despite the previously mentioned strategic ambiguity, Joe Biden said recently that the US would defend Taiwan if China attacked. This goes against strategic ambiguity. Even though a White House spokesperson later said that Joe Biden was not announcing any change in our policy, and there is no change in our policy, Biden himself never clarified this, and didn't clarify afterward either, showing the clear increase in aggressive rhetoric. When global superpowers fight each other directly, it usually ends up pretty horribly, which is why people are scared here. While there are a small number of countries that have full formal diplomatic relations with the ROC. Enough of the partisan fighting. The real Chad here is Bhutan. Bhutan is the only country in the world to not have diplomatic relations with either the PRC and ROC, and does not recognise either government.